"I can't hide it anymore," she told the Amish man, and his eyes said everything. The prairie wind howls through a dusty street. A widow stands trembling in the doorway of a quiet workshop, her son waiting outside. With one breath, she speaks the truth she's hidden for years. Her boy carries the blood of a Comanche warrior. But instead of judgment, the Amish man meets her with a gaze so steady, so piercing, it shakes the ground beneath her feet. What begins as one woman's confession spreads like wildfire through a town already divided by greed and prejudice. A council hungry for land. A fire that lights the night sky. A missing child caught between two worlds. And when torches blaze and rifles rise, neighbors must decide. Will they cling to hatred or dare to stand for mercy? One secret could destroy everything, or become the key to redemption. Will her truth tear her family apart or bring a town to its knees? Comment below and tell me where in the world you're joining from. And if this story made you pause for a moment, hit that subscribe button for more. Clara's wagon wheels creaked against the rutted dirt path as she guided her horse toward home. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the prairie grass, and her hands trembled slightly on the reins. Samuel Lapp's workshop, with its neat rows of wooden projects and orderly tools, already felt like a distant dream. But his expression, that moment of quiet understanding, stayed with her, clear as the autumn sky above. She hadn't meant to tell him. For 6 years, she'd carried the truth of Daniel's heritage close to her heart, sharing it with no one after her father passed. But something about Samuel's steady presence, the peaceful way he worked the wood with such care, had loosened the knot of fear she'd been carrying. The plowshare had been a simple excuse. She'd heard through Mrs. Henderson at the general store that the Amish craftsman charged fair prices for his work, far less than Morris at the smithy. But standing there in his workshop, breathing in the sweet scent of cedar shavings and watching his sure hands smooth rough edges into grace, the words had simply spilled out. "I can't hide it anymore," she'd said, her voice barely above a whisper. Daniel, his father, was Comanche. The confession had hung in the air like dust motes in the lamplight. Clara had braced herself for the judgment, the stern disapproval she'd seen too often in town when people looked at her boy's darker features. But Samuel's clear blue eyes had held nothing but gentle acceptance. He'd set down his plane with deliberate care, giving her words the respect of his full attention. Now, as her wagon rounded the bend toward her small ranch, Clara's mind returned to that moment again and again. Samuel hadn't rushed to fill the silence with empty comfort or harsh words. Instead, he'd simply nodded, his expression thoughtful and kind. "God's children come in many forms," he'd finally said, his voice soft but firm. Each one precious in his sight. Tears pricked at Clara's eyes as she remembered. Such simple words, but they had lifted a weight she'd carried for so long. The constant fear of discovery, the whispers she imagined behind closed doors, it had all grown so heavy. The wagon rattled over a small wooden bridge, and Clara could see smoke rising from her chimney. Daniel would be there, probably adding more wood to the cookstove like she'd asked. Her beautiful boy, with his father's proud bearing and her own stubborn chin. He worked so hard, never complaining about the endless chores that came with running their small spread dot as she drew closer to the house. She could see him in the yard, arms full of split logs. At 12 years old, he was already showing the strength that would one day make him a fine rancher. If they could hold on to the land, that is. Her father's debts still loomed like storm clouds on the horizon. "Mama!" Daniel called out, dropping the wood by the porch and running to help with the wagon. Did the Amish man say he could fix the plowshare? Clara swallowed hard, steadying her voice. Yes, he did. Samuel, Mr. Lapp says he can have it ready by week's end. She climbed down, accepting Daniel's offered hand with a smile. And at a fair price, too. Daniel's face brightened. That's good news. Maybe we can get that south field planted before the frost comes. Clara reached out to brush a wood chip from his dark hair. Maybe so. Let's get these horses settled first. Together, they unhitched the team and led them to the barn. The familiar routine of evening chores helped calm Clara's racing thoughts. As they worked side by side, spreading fresh hay and checking water troughs, she studied her son's profile in the fading light. He had his father's high cheekbones and straight black hair, but his smile was all McCall, the same smile her father had worn when teaching her about the land. "Something on your mind, Mama?" Daniel asked, catching her watchful gaze. Clara shook her head, forcing a light tone. "Just thinking about all we need to do tomorrow. Those fence posts on the north line won't fix themselves." But as they finished their work and headed toward the house, Clara felt a new lightness in her step. Sharing her secret with Samuel, seeing acceptance instead of judgment in his eyes, had given her hope. Hope that maybe there were others who could see past their prejudices to the truth of her family's heart. Inside, the kitchen was warm from the cook stove. Daniel brought in the last of the firewood, while Clara set about preparing their simple supper. The familiar motions of slicing bread and stirring the bean pot brought comfort, but her mind kept drifting back to Samuel's workshop. She remembered how his strong, calloused hands had moved so carefully over the broken plowshare, assessing the damage. There had been no wasted motion, no unnecessary words. Even after her confession, he'd simply returned to examining the metal, explaining how he would repair it, as if nothing extraordinary had passed between them. "A clean break," he'd said, running his finger along the jagged edge. "It can be made whole again." Those words echoed in Clara's heart now as she watched Daniel set the table, humming a tune their neighbor Mrs. Patterson had taught him. Could broken things truly be made whole? Could the weight of secrets and society's harsh judgment be lifted by simple acceptance? The evening settled around them like a soft blanket as they ate their supper. Through the window, Clara could see the first stars appearing in the deepening blue sky. The same stars that had witnessed her love for Daniel's father, that had guided her through the long nights after he was gone, that had watched over her as she built a life for their son. "Mama," Daniel said suddenly, looking up from his plate, "did you know Mr. Lapp builds rocking chairs too? Billy Henderson says his ma got one, and it's the finest chair she's ever sat in." Clara smiled, remembering the beautiful rocker she'd seen in the corner of Samuel's workshop. "Is that so?" "Yes'm. Billy says Mr. Lapp can make anything from wood. Says he's real quiet, the real kind too." "That he is," Clara murmured, her heart warming at her son's innocent observation. "That he certainly is." Later, after Daniel had gone to bed, Clara stood on the porch watching the moon rise over the prairie. The night air was cool and sweet with sage, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote called to its mate. Her father's old ranch stretched out before her, the land he'd worked so hard to build into something lasting. The land she fought now to keep, for Daniel's sake. But for the first time in years, she didn't feel quite so alone in that fight. Samuel's quiet strength and acceptance had shown her that there might be allies in unexpected places. People who could see past the surface to the truth of what mattered: family, hard work, and the courage to stand firm in the face of adversity. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges. There were still debts to pay, fields to plow, and 1,000 daily tasks that came with running a ranch. But tonight, Clara let herself rest in the peace of being truly seen and accepted, if only by one person. It was enough. It was a beginning. The setting sun painted long shadows across Clara's porch as she settled into the worn wooden rocker. Daniel curled against her side. The evening air carried the sweet scent of spring sage, but Clara's thoughts remained fixed on her afternoon at Samuel's workshop. Her confession about Daniel's heritage still echoed in her mind, making her hands tremble as she smoothed her son's dark hair. "Mama," Daniel said, his voice small but clear in the gathering dusk, "why did you tell Mr. Samuel about me?" Clara's heart squeezed. She chose her words carefully, just as she had since Daniel first began asking questions about his father. Sometimes, sweetheart, we need friends we can trust. Mr. Samuel is that kind of friend. Daniel nodded against her shoulder, but she could feel the questions building in him like storm clouds. But why can't everyone know? About grandfather? About the Comanche? The creak of the rocker filled the silence as Clara gathered her courage. People don't always understand things that are different, Daniel. Some folks let fear make them cruel. She turned him gently to face her, meeting eyes that held wisdom beyond his 8 years. We must be careful who we share our truth with. Is that why grandfather stays with his people? Daniel's fingers worried at a loose thread on his sleeve. Why he can't visit us. Clara swallowed hard against the ache in her throat. The memory of her father's choice to return to his adopted Comanche family still brought both pain and pride. Your grandfather loves you very much. One day, when you're older, you'll understand better why things must be this way for now. Daniel's small nod carried more understanding than any child should need to bear. Clara held him closer, watching the first stars appear above the western hills. Morning came too soon, bringing with it the weekly trip to town for supplies. Clara secured her wagon outside Whitman's general store, the spring mud sucking at her boots. Inside, among the familiar smells of coffee and leather, she spotted Samuel arranging tools on a shelf. "Thank you," she whispered as she passed him, meaning far more than the repaired plowshare. "Your kindness yesterday," her voice trailed off, conscious of other customers browsing nearby. Samuel's gentle smile warmed his steady gaze. God's children are all his handiwork, Mrs. McCall, each one precious. Neither noticed Jed Collins lingering by the barrel of nails, his sharp eyes taking in their exchange. Clara hurried through her shopping, but Collins followed her onto the boardwalk, his boots striking the wooden planks with deliberate slowness. "Mighty friendly with the Amish fellow," he drawled, causing Clara to clutch her purchases tighter. "Interesting conversation you were having about young Daniel." Ice formed in Clara's stomach as she realized he must have overheard more than she'd thought. She lifted her chin, meeting his calculating stare. "My son is no concern of yours, Mr. Collins. Everything in this town is my concern, Mrs. McCall." His smile didn't reach his eyes. "Especially matters that might affect decent folks' property values." Clara turned away, her hands shaking as she loaded her wagon. The thread in his words was clear as mountain air. By the time she reached home, the spring sunshine had lost its warmth. That evening, as Clara stirred the bean pot hanging over the cook fire, she noticed more traffic than usual past their fence. Wagons slowed, riders turned in their saddles to stare at Daniel helping with the evening chores. Even old Mrs. Webster, who usually waved cheerfully, hurried past with her eyes straight ahead. The whispers had begun, spreading like wildfire through dry grass. Daniel pushed his spoon through his supper, unusual quiet replacing his normal chatter about his day. "Mama?" he finally asked, his voice smaller than usual. "Tommy said his pa won't let him play with me anymore." Clara's wooden spoon clattered against the pot. She moved to kneel beside his chair, taking his small hands in hers. "Some people are going to say unkind things, Daniel, but that doesn't make them true. Can I still go to school?" His dark eyes searched her face. "Even if they tease?" Clara gathered him close, breathing in the scent of sun and boy and innocence. "Of course you can, my brave one. You have every right to learn, to grow, to be yourself." She stroked his hair, so like his father's, and made a silent vow. She would protect him, no matter what storms gathered on their horizon. Dawn found Clara in town early, hoping to speak with the schoolteacher before classes began. But the sight that greeted her froze her steps. Jed Collins stood on the boardwalk outside the Mercantile, surrounded by a cluster of influential ranchers. His voice carried clearly in the morning air as he gestured emphatically. "Can't have that sort around decent folk," he was saying. property values will plummet. Who knows what other secrets that woman's hiding out there on that ranch? Clara's hands tightened on her reins until her knuckles went white. The fear in her stomach twisted into something harder, more determined. She thought of Samuel's steady acceptance, of Daniel's innocent questions, of her father's courage in living true to both his worlds. She wouldn't let Collins poison their home with his hatred. She couldn't stop the whispers, but she could stand firm against the storm. Daniel deserved nothing less. Turning her wagon, Clara headed home to wake her son for school. She would face whatever came, one day at a time, with the same strength that had carried her through loss and love and motherhood. The morning sun caught the silver cross at her throat, a reminder that grace could appear in unexpected places, like a quiet Amish workshop where truth had been met with kindness instead of condemnation. The morning sun cast long shadows across the schoolyard as Daniel McCall clutched his lunch pail closer. Something had changed since Monday. The other children, usually quick to include him in their games, now huddled in tight circles, their eyes darting his way before turning back to whispered conversations. His heart sank as Tommy Weber, his best friend since first grade, walked right past without so much as a nod inside the one-room schoolhouse. The scratching of chalk against slate tablets seemed louder than usual. Miss Patterson's lesson on multiplication tables couldn't drown out the hushed murmurs behind him. Daniel's ears burned when he caught fragments like half-breed and savage. He kept his eyes fixed on his slate, though the numbers blurred through unshed tears. Back at the ranch, Clara noticed her son's unusual quiet as he helped with the evening chores. "Everything all right at school today?" she asked, watching him scatter feed for the chickens. Daniel shrugged, his small shoulders tight with tension. "Just different is all," he mumbled. Clara's heart ached. The whispers had reached the children first, as poison often did. She knew it wouldn't be long before the adults made their opinions known. That night, after tucking Daniel into bed, she paced the worn floorboards of their kitchen, feeling the walls of their world closing in. The next morning, Clara hitched up her wagon and made her way to Samuel Lapp's workshop. The steady rhythm of his saw greeted her before she reached the door. Inside, the familiar scent of fresh-cut wood wrapped around her like a warm blanket. Samuel looked up from his workbench, his honest face showing genuine welcome. "Good morning, Clara," he said, setting aside his tools. "I don't know if I did right by telling the truth," she blurted out, wringing her hands. "The whole town's talking. Daniel came home from school yesterday, looking like he'd lost his best friend." Samuel wiped his hands on his work apron, considering her words carefully. "Truth can hurt for a time," he said finally, his voice gentle but firm. "But lies destroy forever." Clara let out a shaky breath. There was something steadying about his presence, like a strong fence post in a storm. "How do you always know the right thing to say?" "I just speak what I know to be true," he replied simply. "The Lord gives us burdens, but he also gives us strength to bear them." Before Clara could respond, the workshop door swung open. Martha Weber, Tommy's mother, stood frozen in the doorway, her eyes widening at the sight of Clara. Without a word, she turned and hurried away, her skirts rustling with disapproval. That afternoon, a message arrived by the hand of young Jimmy Patterson. The town council requested Clara's presence at the church hall the following evening. Her hands trembled as she read the formal summons, knowing this was what she had feared most. The next evening, Clara dressed in her best calico dress, the one she usually saved for Sunday services. Daniel watched her pin up her hair with careful fingers. "Why do we have to go to church on a Wednesday?" he asked. "Some men want to talk to us about the ranch," Clara explained, trying to keep her voice steady. "Remember what I taught you about holding your head high?" Daniel nodded solemnly. "Yes, ma'am," like grandfather would want. The church hall buzzed with low conversation when Clara and Daniel entered. The council members sat at a long table at the front, their faces stern in the lamplight. Behind them, Clara noticed several cattle barons, including Jed Collins, watching with calculated interest. "Mrs. McCall," Council Chairman Peterson began, his voice carrying through the now silent room. "We've called this meeting to discuss certain concerns about your father's ranch inheritance." Clara's spine stiffened. "My father's will was properly witnessed and filed. The ranch is legally mine." "Yes, but there are questions about future ownership," Peterson continued. "About whether your son, given his particular circumstances, would be eligible for water rights when he comes of age." Daniel's small hand tightened in hers. Clara felt anger rise in her chest like a summer storm. "My son has every right to his grandfather's legacy. His heritage doesn't change that." Jed Collins stood up from his seat at the back. "Now, Clara, be reasonable. A half-breed boy can't be trusted with good Christian water rights. What's to stop him running off to join them savages?" "Mr. Collins," Clara's voice cut through the murmurs of agreement. "My son was born on this land, baptized in this very church, and raised with as much love and faith as any child here. His father's people respect the land and water far more than those who would steal it through false righteousness." The council members shifted uncomfortably. Chairman Peterson cleared his throat. "We'll need time to consider the legal implications. For now, no decision will be made regarding future water rights." Clara recognized the gleam in the cattle baron's eyes. They were already planning, calculating how to use this delay to their advantage. She led Daniel out with her head high, though her heart pounded like a hammer against iron. The walk home seemed longer than usual, the evening air heavy with unspoken fears. As they approached their ranch house, Clara noticed a burlap sack on the porch. Inside, she found fresh ground flour and a small wooden toy, a perfectly carved horse that could only have come from Samuel's workshop. That night, after Daniel was asleep, Clara knelt beside her bed. The moonlight filtered through her window, casting soft shadows on the worn quilt her mother had made. "Lord," she whispered, "give me the strength to face whatever comes." As she prayed, she realized that her confession to Samuel had marked more than just the beginning of their troubles. It had also been the first step towards something else, something that felt like hope. The carved horse sat on her bedside table, its strong lines suggesting movement even in stillness. Like Samuel's words in the workshop, it offered silent comfort. Sometimes the hardest path, the path of truth, was also the path to redemption in the quiet darkness. Clara remembered Samuel's steady gaze, his simple wisdom about truth and lies. Whatever trials lay ahead, she knew she had done right by choosing honesty. The whispers might grow louder, the threats more real, but she would face them standing in the light of truth rather than hiding in the shadows of deception. Through her window, she could see the stars scattered across the vast Texas sky, the same stars that shone over Daniel's father's people, over Samuel's workshop, over all of God's creation. Somewhere in that expanse, she found the courage to believe that tomorrow would bring not just challenges, but also unexpected allies and moments of grace. 2 days after the tense council meeting, Clara's hands trembled as she opened the letter left by the postman. The morning sun streamed through her kitchen window, catching dust motes in its beam. But her heart felt cold as she read the crisp black words, "Land claim under review." She sank into her father's old chair, the wood creaking beneath her like a sympathetic sigh. The water rights. Of course, it came down the water. Her small creek fed the cattle trails, making her modest plot worth far more than its size suggested. She'd watched the cattle baron's hungry eyes during the council meeting, their fingers drumming on leather portfolios stuffed with banknotes and promises. The screen door squeaked, and Daniel bounded in from his morning chores. "Mama, the chickens laid 8 eggs today." His smile faded when he saw her face. "What's wrong?" Clara folded the letter carefully, tucking away her worry behind a gentle smile. "Just grown-up business, sweetheart." Why don't you go wash up for breakfast? As Daniel's boots clattered up the stairs, hoofbeats approached outside. Through the window, Clara spotted Samuel Lapp's familiar black buggy, his steady hands holding the reins. Her heart lifted despite herself. There was something so solid about Samuel, like an oak tree in a storm. He tied his horse and approached her porch with purpose in his stride. "Clara," he called softly, "I heard about the council's letter. News traveled fast in their small town, especially bad news." She stepped onto the porch, wiping her hands on her apron. "They want to review everything, the deed, the water rights." Daniel's. She couldn't finish. Samuel's quiet strength seemed to fill the space between them. "I came to tell you. I will stand witness to your character before the council. They know me as a man of my word." Clara's eyes widened. For an Amish man to step into English affairs this way was no small thing. "Samuel, your people, my people believe in truth and justice," he said simply. "What they do to you and Daniel isn't right." Emotion welled up in Clara's throat. Would you stay for supper?" "Daniel would love it, and I've got fresh bread cooling." A smile touched Samuel's normally solemn face. "Yeah, I would like that very much." That evening, Clara's kitchen glowed with warmth and life. Daniel perched at the table, watching in fascination as Samuel explained how to whittle a simple wooden horse. The boy's questions tumbled out like water over stones. Do Amish horses wear special shoes? Why do you use draft horses instead of regular ones? Does God love Amish horses more? Daniel's earnest curiosity made both adults smile. Samuel answered each question with patient care. "God loves all his creatures equally," he explained, demonstrating how to angle the knife safely, just as he loves all his children. Clara, setting out plates of chicken and dumplings, caught the gentle message in his words. Her heart warmed at how naturally Samuel spoke with Daniel, never talking down to him or showing a hint of prejudice. The lamplight cast a golden glow over their simple meal, making even the worn tablecloth seem rich as silk. For a moment, Clara could almost imagine this was normal. A family sharing supper, sharing stories, sharing life. But beyond their windows, darkness gathered like storm clouds. Sunday morning arrived clear and cool. Clara smoothed Daniel's hair one last time before they climbed the church steps. She felt the stares immediately, Mrs. Peterson's shocked gasp, Tom Wheeler's disapproving frown, Jed Collins' narrowed eyes. They found a pew near the back, but whispers followed them like angry wasps. "The nerve, bringing that boy here. What's our town coming to?" "Someone ought to do something." Pastor Whitcomb cleared his throat from the pulpit, his sermon notes rustling. "Today, brothers and sisters, we consider how the Lord tests us with difficult situations. Some children come to us through challenging circumstances." Clara's cheeks burned. Daniel pressed closer to her side, his small hand finding hers. She squeezed it gently, willing him strength. That movement caught her eye. Samuel and his family filing into their usual seats, plain dark clothes stark against the painted walls. As the pastor stumbled through his veiled references, Samuel bowed his head in prayer. But Clara saw how he angled himself slightly toward their pew, a silent gesture of support that spoke louder than any sermon. The service dragged on. Each met an eternity of sidelong glances and muttered comments. When the final hymn ended, Clara hurried Daniel out before anyone could corner them. But she carried Samuel's quiet solidarity with her like a shield. That night, after Daniel was tucked into bed, Clara knelt beside him in the dark. His peaceful breathing filled the room as she stroked his hair, so like his father's, straight and black as a raven's wing. Moonlight silvered his cheeks, making him look almost ethereal. "I promise you, my love," she whispered, her voice catching. "I'll fight for your future with everything I have." Her courage felt thin as paper, but she would not let them tear away Daniel's birthright. Not his land, not his dignity, not his place in this community. Thought she remembered Samuel's steady presence in church, how he'd chosen to align himself with them despite the cost to his own standing. Perhaps she wasn't as alone as she'd thought. Perhaps there was still hope, as fragile as a candle flame but just as bright in the darkness. Daniel stirred in his sleep, murmuring something about horses. Clara smiled through her tears, bending to kiss his forehead. Tomorrow would bring new battles, but for now, in this quiet moment, she let herself believe in the power of simple things: a shared meal, an honest friend, a child's innocent questions. These were weapons, too, in their way. Weapons against hatred and fear. Rising from her knees, Clara moved to the window. The moon hung low over her father's land, Daniel's land, if she could keep it safe. Out there in the night, someone had drawn a line between us and them, between right and wrong. But Samuel had shown her today that such lines could be crossed, that bridges could be built even between the most separate of worlds. She thought of how naturally he'd sat at her table, teaching Daniel to whittle, answering questions about faith and horses with equal care. It was a small thing, perhaps, but small things could grow. Like seeds in spring soil, like hope in a weary heart. Clara touched the window glass, cool against her fingers. The council's letter sat heavy in her apron pocket, but it no longer seemed quite so final. She had allies now, unexpected ones, but true. And she had her father's stubborn spirit, her mother's quiet strength, and most of all, her love for Daniel burning bright as a star. Let them whisper. Let them stare. She would stand her ground, and she would not stand alone. The morning sun crept through Clara's bedroom window, casting long shadows across the weathered floorboards. She stood before her father's old trunk, running her fingers along its brass latches. The leather-bound chest held what remained of James McCall's earthly possessions, and perhaps the answer to her prayers. "Mama?" Daniel's voice drifted from the kitchen. "Can I help?" "Come on in, sweetheart." Clara lifted the heavy lid. The familiar scent of leather and old paper wafted up, stirring memories of her father bent over his desk late at night, scratching away with his pen. Daniel knelt beside her as she carefully lifted out bundles of letters, faded photographs, and documents. Her hands trembled slightly as she sorted through them. There had to be something here, something her father left behind that could help them keep the ranch. "What are we looking for?" Daniel asked, picking up a tintype photograph of his grandfather in his Sunday best. "Papers about the ranch, about our water." Clara's voice caught as she lifted a brittle envelope she'd never noticed before. Her name was written across it in her father's bold hand. The seal was unbroken. "What's that, Mama?" Clara's heart quickened. "A letter from your grandfather." She carefully broke the seal, unfolding the paper inside. Her eyes moved across the neat rows of text, widening as she read. "Daniel," she whispered, "your grandfather filed water rights in my name before he passed. Not in his and mine." She read further, hope blooming in her chest. If these papers were true, the cattle barons couldn't touch their water rights. But she needed to be certain. "We need to ride to Cedar Grove," she said, already mentally preparing for the journey. "To see the county clerk." Daniel's eyes lit up at the prospect of an adventure. "When do we leave?" "Right now. Pack a change of clothes. It's too far to make it there and back in one day." Within the hour, Clara had hitched up their wagon and packed provisions for the journey. The morning air was crisp as they set out, the wagon wheels creaking over the rutted trail that led east towards Cedar Grove. The sun climbed high as they traveled, Daniel pointing out hawks circling overhead and asking endless questions about their destination. Clara welcomed his chatter. It kept her mind off her worries and the long road ahead. By late afternoon, dust coated their clothes, and the wagon springs squeaked in protest at every bump. Daniel had grown quiet, tired from the journey. Clara's back ached from the constant jostling, but she pressed on, knowing they needed to reach the inn before nightfall. Sun was setting when they finally spotted the weathered sign of Mason's Roadside Inn. The two-story building looked welcoming with its lit windows and smoke curling from the chimney. "Welcome, Mrs. McCall." Sarah Mason greeted them at the door. Her kind face was familiar from previous visits to town. "And young Daniel. My, how you've grown." The inn's common room was warm and inviting, with a hearty stew bubbling on the cooking hearth. After their simple but filling supper, Clara tucked Daniel into a narrow bed in their small room. Despite his protests that he wasn't tired, he fell asleep almost immediately. Clara sat in the room's single chair, watching her son's peaceful face in the lamplight. Tomorrow would bring answers. She prayed they would be the ones she needed. Dawn found them back on the road. Breakfast wrapped in a cloth napkin, courtesy of Mrs. Mason. The morning passed slowly as the wagon rolled towards Cedar Grove. By early afternoon, the county courthouse came into view, its red brick walls rising above the surrounding buildings. Clara helped Daniel down from the wagon, straightening his collar before they climbed the courthouse steps. Inside, the air was cool and still, heavy with the smell of old paper and ink. The clerk, Mr. Peterson, peered at them over his spectacles as Clara presented the letter and explained her situation. His fingers moved efficiently through the thick ledgers, checking and cross-referencing as Clara held her breath. "Yes," he finally said, adjusting his spectacles. "These water rights were indeed filed in your name, Mrs. McCall. Your father made sure of it before his passing." He showed her the official record, her name clearly written in careful script. Relief flooded through Clara's body, making her knees weak. She steadied herself against the clerk's desk, grateful for Daniel's small hand slipping into hers. "Thank you," she managed to say. "Could I get a copy of the record?" The clerk nodded, already reaching for fresh paper. The scratch of his pen seemed to echo in the quiet office as he carefully copied out the details. The return journey felt lighter somehow, despite the gathering clouds. Clara's mind was already racing ahead to the next council meeting, planning how to present this evidence. They were perhaps an hour from home when she spotted a familiar figure on horseback approaching their wagon. Samuel Lapp pulled his horse alongside, his usually calm face showing signs of worry. "Clara," he said, his voice carrying relief. "I stopped by the ranch this morning." When no one was there, he trailed off, clearly uncomfortable admitting his concern. "We rode to Cedar Grove," Clara explained, unable to keep the joy from her voice. She told him about finding the letter and the clerk's confirmation. Samuel's eyes brightened at the news, but then grew serious. "This is good," he said carefully. "But truth ange those who profit from lies." His words carried the weight of warning. Clara nodded, sobered by his caution but not deterred. "I know, but it's time they learned that this land and its water belongs to us fair and square." Samuel rode beside them the rest of the way home, his presence a quiet comfort as the sun began to set. When they reached the ranch, he helped unhitch the wagon while Daniel fed the horses. That night, after Samuel had gone and Daniel was asleep, Clara sat at her kitchen table. The copy of the water rights lay before her, official and undeniable. Outside, a coyote called in the distance, and somewhere an owl answered. She felt different than she had just days ago, stronger, more certain. The truth about Daniel was out, and now she had proof of their right to the land and water. Whatever the council tried next, she would face it standing tall. Clara carefully folded the precious document and placed it in her father's Bible for safekeeping. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but tonight, she could rest knowing she had what she needed to protect her son's inheritance. As she banked the fire for the night, Clara whispered a prayer of thanks for her father's foresight, for Samuel's steadfast friendship, and for the strength she felt growing in her heart. The ranch was theirs, and she would make sure it stayed that way. Clara's fingers trembled as she gripped the brittle papers, standing before the council in the one-room church. Late afternoon sunlight streamed through tall windows, casting long shadows across worn wooden floorboards. The room buzzed with whispers, packed with townsfolk eager to witness the second hearing. "These documents," Clara said, her voice stronger than she felt, "show my father deeded the water rights directly to me." She passed the papers to Judge Morton, who adjusted his spectacles with weathered hands. Daniel pressed close to her skirts, his small hand warm in hers. From the corner of her eye, she caught Samuel's steady presence near the back wall, his broad-brimmed hat held respectfully in his hands. His quiet strength seemed to flow across the space between them, steadying her racing heart. Judge Morton cleared his throat, the sound echoing in the sudden hush. "These appear to be properly filed with the county clerk." He passed the documents to the other council members, who bent their heads together, muttering. From his seat among the cattle barons, Jed Collins surged to his feet. "Those papers could be forged. We all know what kind of woman she is, hiding secrets about her boy's blood. Mr. Collins," Judge Morton's gavel cracked against wood, "the county clerk has verified these documents. The water rights belong to Mrs. McCall, legal and proper." A wave of murmurs swept through the crowd. Clara felt Daniel squeeze her hand, and she squeezed back, her throat tight with emotion. After so many years of uncertainty, of carrying her fears alone, the truth stood validated before all. "Furthermore," Judge Morton continued, "any previous questions regarding inheritance are hereby settled. The McCall Ranch and its water rights belong to Clara McCall, to pass to her son as she sees fit." Jed Collins's face darkened like a thundercloud. He exchanged glances with the other cattle barons, their fury plain as day. But Clara kept her chin high, drawing strength from Daniel's presence and Samuel's unwavering support died as the crowd began to disperse. Something shifted in the air. Neighbors who had crossed the street to avoid her now paused, offering tentative nods. Mrs. Peterson, the baker's wife, even touched Clara's arm. That was brave, standing up like that. Old Mr. Tucker, who had known her father, tipped his hat. "Your pa would be proud, Miss Clara. He always said you had his spirit." Each small gesture felt like a balm on years of hidden wounds. Daniel's eyes shone as they walked to their wagon, his steps lighter than she had seen in weeks. Samuel appeared beside them, helping Daniel up onto the seat. "Much obliged," Clara said softly, meeting his gentle gaze. "Truth has its own power," Samuel replied, his voice carrying that calm certainty she had come to treasure. "It breaks chains we sometimes forget we wear." The ride home felt different somehow, as if the very air had changed. The setting sun painted the prairie grass in shades of gold, and Clara found herself humming an old hymn her mother used to sing. Daniel joined in, their voices carrying across the open land that was now, without question, their own dot in the ranch. Kitchen. Clara lit the lamps and set about making supper with a lighter heart than she had known in years. The familiar sense of frying potatoes and baking cornbread filled the warm air. Daniel set the table without being asked, carefully placing the blue and white plates his grandfather had given her as a wedding gift. "Mama," he said, watching her, slide golden cornbread from the pan. "Does this mean we can stay forever?" Clara paused, drinking in his hopeful expression. "Yes, my love. This land is ours, sure as sunrise." They sat together at the scarred oak table, saying grace with particular feeling. The simple meal tasted like celebration. Crispy potatoes seasoned just right, cornbread dripping with butter, and honey, tall glasses of cool well water that was truly their own. Daniel told stories about his day, his laughter ringing free and easy in a way she hadn't heard since the whispers began. Clara found herself laughing too, remembering her own childhood adventures on this very land dot as the evening deepened. Clara lit the last lamp and settled Daniel into bed. Kneeling beside him, she offered prayers of thanksgiving, her heart so full it brought tears to her eyes. "Mama?" Daniel's sleepy voice drifted up. Will Samuel come visit again? I reckon he might, Clara answered, smoothing his dark hair. Would you like that? Daniel nodded, already drifting towards sleep. He shows me how to whittle proper. Says I got steady hands. Clara tucked the quilt around him, overcome with gratitude for Samuel's gentle acceptance of her boy. Once Daniel's breathing settled into the rhythm of dreams, she moved to the kitchen window. The prairie stretched vast and dark beyond the lamplight, scattered with stars like diamonds on velvet. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called, answered by its mate. Clara pressed her hands together, offering one more prayer of thanks for this day of deliverance, for truth finally spoken and accepted, for the chance to hold her head high again far across the grassland. However, pinpricks of torchlight moved like fireflies through the darkness. The cattle barons gathered in secret, their anger burning hotter than any flame. But Clara, standing in her kitchen's warm glow, did not see them. She saw only the promise of tomorrow, of a future where Daniel could grow proud and strong, where truth had set them free at last. Clara stood at her kitchen window, washing the last of the supper dishes as twilight settled over the prairie. The evening's peace felt earned after her victory at the council meeting. Daniel sat at the table, practicing his letters by lamplight, his pencil scratching softly against paper. A flicker of orange caught her eye. At first, she thought it was just the setting sun playing tricks on the horizon. Then her heart stopped. Smoke rose in thick plumes against the darkening sky, and flames danced across her far pasture like devil's fingers. Daniel! Clara dropped the dish towel and grabbed her shawl. Fire in the south pasture. Get the water buckets. They burst out the front door together. The acrid smell of burning grass filled her lungs. Wind whipped the flames higher, sending sparks dancing through the air like fireflies gone mad. The blaze advanced quickly, consuming the dry summer grass. The cattle! Clara shouted. She could hear their frightened lowing from the fenced pasture. Daniel, fill those buckets while I get them clear. Clara ran toward the pasture, her skirts hitched up. The heat pressed against her face as she approached the fence line. Smoke stung her eyes, but she could make out the dark shapes of her small herd, bunched together in panic. The fire hadn't reached them yet, but it was coming fast. She yanked the gate open, waving her arms. Yeah, get on now. Move! Her voice cracked with desperation as she herded them toward safety. The animals thundered past, their eyes rolling white with terror. Through the thickening smoke, Clara made out figures approaching on horseback. Samuel Lapp rode at the lead, two other Amish men close behind. They must have seen the glow from their farms. Samuel's usually neat black hat was askew, his face etched with concern. Clara. He dismounted quickly. Where do you need us? The fence line. She pointed to where flames were already consuming the wooden posts. If we lose those fences, Samuel nodded, understanding all she didn't say. Without those fences, her cattle would scatter. Without cattle, the ranch couldn't survive. They formed a bucket brigade, passing water from the well to the advancing fire. Clara's arms ached, but she didn't slow. Sweat and soot streaked her face. The flames hissed and sputtered where the water hit, but the fire seemed to laugh at their efforts, leaping to new patches of grass. Daniel! Clara called out, realizing she hadn't heard his voice in several minutes. Daniel, where are you? No answer came through the roar of the fire. Daniel! Her voice rose higher, panic clawing at her throat. She spun in circles, searching the smoky darkness. Has anyone seen my boy? The Amish men shook their heads. Other neighbors had arrived now, joining the fight against the flames, but none had seen Daniel. Clara's bucket slipped from nerveless fingers. Daniel! She ran toward the house, then the barn, then the tool shed. Each shadowy corner was empty. Her chest felt too tight to breathe. Someone in the crowd muttered, just loud enough to hear. Reckon them Comanche could. No. Clara whirled toward the voice, her fear turning to fury. "Don't you dare! He's just a child!" But the whisper had already spread through the gathered neighbors. Clara saw it in their faces, the old prejudices, the easy assumptions. Even as they helped save her land, they judged her son. Samuel stepped forward, his quiet voice cutting through the murmurs. "We will find him. First, we contain this fire. Then, we search. All of us." He met the eyes of those around him, his steady gaze a challenge to their prejudice. The bucket line resumed with renewed vigor. Clara forced herself to help, though every muscle in her body screamed to run into the darkness, calling Daniel's name. After what felt like hours, they finally beat back the worst of the flames. The fence line was scorched, but mostly standing. Large patches of pasture were blackened waste, but her house and barn had been spared. Clara stumbled to her porch steps and sank down, her legs unable to hold her any longer. Soot streaked her face where tears had cut through the grime. "Please, Lord," she whispered. Then her voice grew stronger with desperation. "Please, bring him back to me. He's all I have." Samuel approached quietly and knelt beside her. His own face was smoke-stained, his clothes smelling of fire, but his eyes held the same steady kindness she'd first seen in his workshop. "The Lord does not forsake," he said softly. "Not you, not Daniel." Clara looked up at him through tear-blurred eyes. "How can you be so sure?" "Because I have seen his hand at work in you both." Samuel's voice was gentle but firm. "You stood before the council with truth and dignity. Daniel has a pure heart that no amount of gossip can taint. God does not abandon such faith." His words wrapped around her like a warm blanket, holding her together when she felt ready to shatter. Clara drew in a shaky breath, trying to find strength in his certainty. The night stretched dark around them, filled with the murmur of neighbors organizing search parties, the crackle of dying flames, and the desperate prayer of a mother's heart. Dawn painted the prairie sky in streaks of amber and rose, but Clara McCall felt none of its beauty. Her heart hammered against her ribs as riders gathered at her scorched ranch. The acrid smell of burned grass still hung in the air, mixing with the leather and sweat of mounting horses. Sheriff Raines adjusted his hat, squinting toward the cattle barons who joined the search party. "Likely them Comanche," he drawled, not meeting Clara's eyes. "Been reports of 'em crossing the territory lately." Clara's hands tightened on her reins. The accusation stung like a slap. She knew in her bones this had nothing to do with Daniel's Comanche kin. But arguing would waste precious time. They needed to find her boy. Samuel Lapp stood apart from the others, his plain black hat marking him clearly as Amish among the cowboys. Clara watched him whisper something to his bishop, who nodded gravely. Then Samuel did something that made her catch her breath. He mounted a horse, breaking with his people's customs. "Miss McCall," Samuel said softly as he guided his mount beside hers, "I aim to help find Daniel." The morning light caught the quiet determination in his eyes. Jed Collins, one of the wealthy ranchers, sneered. "Ain't proper for a woman to join the search. Or a plain folk neither. My son is out there." Clara's voice cracked but held firm. "I'm riding." The search party spread out across the prairie, hooves thundering against sun-baked earth. Clara's eyes burned from lack of sleep, but she scanned every shadow, every fold in the land. Samuel stayed close, reading sign with the skill of one who'd grown up watching the land. The morning wore into afternoon. The rocky hills rose before them, sharp against the sky. Clara's mount stumbled on loose stones, and Samuel's hand shot out to steady her reins. "There," he pointed. Fresh tracks crossed a patch of bare ground. Small boots headed toward the hills. Hope and fear warred in Clara's chest as they followed the trail. The horses picked their way carefully down a dry creek bed, where drought had left only sun-cracked mud and scattered stones. Something pale caught Clara's eye. She slid from her saddle, legs shaking as she knelt. A scrap of fabric fluttered from a thorny branch, the blue and white check of Daniel's shirt. Her fingers trembled as she clutched it. "Daniel!" Her cry echoed off the creek banks. Only silence answered. Clara's knees gave way. The weight of fear, exhaustion, and despair crashed over her. But before she could collapse, strong hands caught her shoulders. Samuel helped her stand, his touch gentle but sure. "We will not stop," he said, voice low and certain as bedrock. "Not until we find him." Sheriff Raines called a halt as sunset approached. "Too dangerous to search these hills in the dark. We'll make camp and start fresh at first light." Clara wanted to scream, to rage against waiting even one more hour. But she knew he was right. The hills were treacherous enough in daylight. They made camp in a small hollow. The cowboys built a fire that crackled low, sending sparks dancing toward the emerging stars. Clara couldn't eat the jerky someone offered. Her eyes stayed fixed on the hills, dark shapes against the deeper darkness of night. Coyotes began their nightly chorus, their eerie yips echoing across the prairie. Each sound made Clara flinch, imagining Daniel alone and frightened. She wrapped her arms around herself, shivering despite the lingering warmth of the day. Samuel settled nearby, his presence solid and reassuring. He didn't offer empty words of comfort. Instead, he began to pray quietly in Pennsylvania Dutch, the familiar rhythm of his native tongue carrying peace, even though she couldn't understand the words. Clara tilted her head back, looking up at the vast spread of stars. Her own prayers rose wordless but desperate to heaven. "Please, Lord, please keep my boy safe. Please guide us to him. Your Daniel is strong," Samuel said softly after a while. Like his mother. Clara turned to look at him, seeing the firelight reflected in his steady gaze. "Why did you come?" she whispered. "Your people. Some things matter more than custom." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "The Lord calls us to love our neighbors, to bear one another's burdens." Tears slid down Clara's cheeks, cutting clean tracks through the dust of the day's ride. "I'm scared, Samuel. What if?" "No." His voice was gentle but firm. "We will find him." The night stretched long, marked by the slow wheel of stars overhead. Clara dozed fitfully, jerking awake at every sound. Samuel kept watch, a quiet sentinel in the darkness. His unwavering faith gave her strength to hold on to hope. The coyote's song rose and fell, carried on the night wind. Clara clutched Daniel's scrap of shirt to her heart, praying it would lead them to more than just another empty trail tomorrow. She had to believe Samuel's words. They would find him. They had to. The fire burned low, casting dancing shadows across the sleeping forms of the search party. Tomorrow would bring either heartbreak or joy. For now, Clara could only wait, surrounded by the vast prairie night, holding tight to faith and the comfort of Samuel's steadfast presence. Above them, the stars continued their eternal dance, watching over all their children, lost and found, peaceful and troubled, each one precious in the sight of heaven. Dawn broke over the prairie in streaks of amber and rose, painting long shadows across the rocky terrain. Samuel stood from his spot by the dying campfire, his broad-brimmed hat casting shade over concerned eyes. Clara hadn't slept, her face drawn with exhaustion and worry. "We must eat something," Samuel said softly, offering her a piece of journey bread from his saddlebag. "We cannot search well without strength." Clara's hands trembled as she took the simple fare. "I keep seeing his face, Samuel. Every time I close my eyes," her voice cracked. "We will find him," Samuel assured her, his steady presence anchoring her against the tide of fear. The morning air carried the scent of sage and dust as they mounted their horses, joining the other searchers who had camped nearby. The sun climbed higher, beating down mercilessly as they followed the faint trail through the hills. Clara's mare picked her way carefully over loose shale, while Samuel rode slightly ahead, studying the ground. By midday, they approached a deep ravine cut into the red earth. Samuel raised his hand, signaling the group to halt. There, he pointed to fresh marks in the dust. Someone passed here recently. Clara's heart leaped as she dismounted, nearly stumbling in her haste. There, pressed into a patch of soft earth, was the clear print of a child's boot. "Daniel," she whispered, hope surging through her veins. They followed the signs down into the ravine, where thick cottonwoods provided welcome shade. The walls of rock rose around them like nature's fortress, and there, in a protected hollow, Clara saw movement. Her breath caught in her throat. Daniel emerged from behind a boulder, whole and unharmed. "Mama!" he cried out, running toward her. Clara fell to her knees, gathering her son into her arms with a sob of relief. She pressed her face into his hair, breathing in his familiar scent mixed with smoke and dust. "My boy, my precious boy," she murmured, unable to stop her tears. But they weren't alone. From the shadows of the ravine, a tall figure emerged, dignified, weathered, wrapped in a blanket despite the heat. Lone Hawk, Daniel's grandfather, stood watching the reunion with dark eyes that held both wisdom and wariness. Clara's arms tightened instinctively around Daniel, years of prejudice warring with the truth before her. Lone Hawk spoke first, his voice deep and measured. The fire came fast. The boy was near the fence line. I saw him through the smoke. Understanding dawned in Clara's heart. "You saved him," she said softly. Lone Hawk nodded once. "He is blood of my blood. I kept him safe until the hunters passed." His gesture encompassed the rough country around them, where he had hidden with Daniel while search parties thundered past. The moment of peace shattered as hoofbeats approached. The sheriff and several ranchers, including Jed Collins, rounded the bend into the ravine. The sight of Lone Hawk sent rifles rising, metal gleaming in the filtered sunlight. "Step away from the boy, Indian." Sheriff Raines barked, his horse dancing nervously beneath him. Clara stood, positioning herself between the guns and her son. "No, you don't understand. He took the child." Jed Collins shouted, his face red with anger. "We all knew it had come to this." Samuel moved then, his tall frame straight and unafraid as he stepped forward. The quiet power of his presence drew all eyes. "Does the judge before knowing truth?" he asked, his voice carrying clearly in the ravine. This man saved Daniel from the fire that they were so quick to blame on his people. The sheriff's rifle wavered slightly. "That true, boy?" he asked Daniel, who clutched his mother's skirts. "Grandfather pulled me away when the fence caught fire," Daniel said clearly. "He carried me here where it was safe." A murmur ran through the gathered men. Samuel pressed his advantage, speaking with the gentle authority that came from his deep faith. "He saved the boy. You would call rescue a crime? What does that say about the darkness in your own hearts?" The words hung in the air like the afternoon heat. One by one, rifle barrels lowered, though suspicious glares remained. The sheriff cleared his throat awkwardly. Well then, no crime here, I reckon. Best we ride back to town." The mounted men turned their horses, though Jed Collins lingered, his face twisted with thwarted rage. "This ain't finished," he muttered, before spurring his horse away. As dust settled in their wake, Clara turned to Lone Hawk, shame coloring her cheeks. "I'm sorry," she said softly, "for doubting, for letting fear rule my heart all these years. Thank you for protecting him." Lone Hawk's expression softened as he looked at Daniel. "He has your spirit, daughter of my daughter." And her eyes. He reached out, touching Daniel's dark hair in blessing. "The boy should know both his peoples. There is strength in that." Clara nodded, tears threatening again. "You're welcome at our ranch, anytime." "Daniel should know his grandfather." Samuel stood quietly by, a smile touching his usually solemn face as he watched understanding bridge the chasm of years and prejudice. Daniel looked between his mother and grandfather, his young face bright with wonder at this new connection. The afternoon light slanted golden through the ravine as they prepared to return home. Clara's heart felt lighter than it had in years, despite the ashes waiting at her ranch. Something precious had been saved from the fire, not just her son's life, but the truth of who they were, no longer hidden in shadows of shame. As they mounted their horses, Daniel riding double with his mother, Lone Hawk raised his hand in farewell. "I will come," he promised, his words carrying the weight of renewed family bonds. Clara touched her son's hands where they gripped her waist, feeling the future opening before them like the wide prairie sky. Samuel fell in beside them as they rode out of the ravine, his quiet strength a comfort as always. The three of them headed home together, while behind them, Lone Hawk watched his grandson disappear into the distance, knowing it would not be their last meeting. Clara's wagon creaked down the familiar dirt road toward home, every bump and rattle echoing the weariness in her bones. Daniel dozed against her shoulder while Samuel drove the team, his steady hands guiding them through the morning light. As they crested the final hill, Clara's heart clenched at the sight below. The ranch lay wounded. Blackened fence posts stretched like broken teeth along the property line. The sweetgrass pasture, once green and rich, now spread before them in patches of ash and char. Even the old cottonwood tree near the barn wore a scorched streak up its trunk. "Mama," Daniel whispered, "will the grass grow back?" Clara pulled him closer. "Yes, sweet boy. The Lord sends rain, and the prairie always returns." Samuel brought the wagon to a halt near the house. He helped them down, his hands gentle but sure. Without a word, he strode to the wagon bed and began unloading timber he brought from his workshop. "You don't have to," Clara started. "I know," Samuel said simply. He gave her that steady look that had become so familiar, so comforting. "But I will." Throughout the morning, the sharp rhythm of Samuel's hammer rang across the ranch. Post by post, rail by rail, he rebuilt what the fire had destroyed. Daniel trailed after him like a shadow, holding nails and asking endless questions about wood and tools. Clara watched them between her own tasks, something warm and tender growing in her chest despite everything. Near noon, movement caught her eye. A lone rider approached from the west, his form growing clearer as he drew near. Clara recognized the dignity in his bearing, the careful way he guided his horse. Lone Hawk, he dismounted at the gate, leading his paint pony. Slung across his saddle were bundles wrapped in deerskin. "I bring food," he said, his voice deep and measured. "And medicine for burns." Clara's throat tightened with gratitude. "Thank you," she managed. "Please, come in." Lone Hawk nodded, retrieving his bundles. Inside the kitchen, he unwrapped smoked venison and small pouches of herbs. His weathered hands moved with precise care as he explained each medicine's use, which leaves to steep for pain, which poultice would help healing. Daniel watched with wide eyes, drinking in every word from his grandfather. The boy's presence seemed to soften something in Lone Hawk's face, though his dignity never wavered. As afternoon eased toward evening, Clara found herself reaching for the cornmeal bin. "Will you stay?" she asked Lone Hawk. "Share our supper?" A pause stretched between them, heavy with meaning. They both knew what it meant. A Comanche elder at a white woman's table, visible through her windows to any passing neighbor. "I would be honored," he said finally. Clara set to work, the familiar motions of cooking settling her spirit. She mixed cornbread and stirred a pot of rabbit stew, adding some of the herbs Lone Hawk had brought. Samuel finished the last fence rail and came in, washing up at the pump outside before joining them. The lamp cast a warm glow as they gathered around Clara's table. Daniel sat between his mother and grandfather, his small face glowing with joy at having them both there. Samuel bowed his head to offer a quiet prayer in German. Then Lone Hawk spoke brief words in Comanche, his hand gesturing to the 4 directions. They passed the cornbread, steam rising from the golden squares. Clara watched as her son carefully broke his piece in half, offering the larger portion to his grandfather with perfect childhood gravity. Lone Hawk accepted it with equal seriousness, though his eyes held a glimmer of warmth. The crunch of wagon wheels outside drew their attention. Through the window, Clara could see the widow Jensen's buggy passing slowly, the old woman's face clearly visible as she craned her neck to stare. Shortly after, Tom Baker rode past, his horse's pace suspiciously slow. Clara felt her shoulders trying to hunch, that old instinct to hide rising up. But then she looked at her table, at her son's bright face, at Samuel's quiet strength, at Lone Hawk's dignified presence, and something shifted in her heart. She straightened her spine and reached for the stew pot. "More, grandfather?" Daniel asked, the kinship term falling naturally from his lips. "Thank you, grandson," Lone Hawk replied, holding out his bowl. Samuel watched Clara as she served another portion, his eyes holding that same steady acceptance she'd seen that first day in his workshop. But now there was something more there too, a deepening warmth that made her cheeks flush when their gazes met Dot outside. More hoofbeats passed. More whispers would circle the town by morning. Clara knew there would be consequences for this evening, for choosing to welcome Lone Hawk openly into her home. But as she watched Daniel demonstrating to his grandfather how Samuel had taught him to hold a hammer that morning, she felt nothing but peace. The lamp flickered, casting their shadows on the wall, 4 figures drawn together by love, courage, and the simple act of sharing bread. Through her window, Clara could see the stars beginning to emerge above her scorched pasture. Tomorrow, she would face whatever new challenges came. But tonight, in this moment, she was no longer hiding. No longer afraid. Samuel broke the comfortable silence, his voice gentle. "The fence work is solid now. Tomorrow we can start on the barn repairs." Lone Hawk nodded. "I will bring more meat. The hunting is good to the west." "Much obliged," Clara said softly, meaning far more than just the offer of food. Daniel yawned, fighting to keep his eyes open. Clara saw both Samuel and Lone Hawk hide small smiles at the boy's determination to stay up with the adults. "Time for bed, sweet boy," she said, rising to clear the dishes. "But Mama, listen to your mother," Lone Hawk said, his tone fond but firm. "A warrior needs his rest." Daniel straightened at that, pride replacing his protest. He hugged his grandfather carefully, then Samuel, before letting Clara guide him toward his room. When she returned to the kitchen, Samuel was collecting his hat while Lone Hawk gathered his medicine pouches. Both men nodded to each other, a gesture of mutual respect that brought fresh tears to Clara's eyes. Through her window, she could see more curious townsfolk passing by, their faces pale ovals in the growing dark. But Clara no longer felt the need to draw her curtains. Let them look. Let them see that love could bridge any divide, that courage could overcome any prejudice. She stood in her doorway, watching Samuel walk toward his wagon and Lone Hawk mount his paint pony. Her heart was full, knowing that whatever tomorrow brought, she was no longer alone in her stand for truth and dignity. The evening stars spread their light across her wounded land, promising healing and hope for all the days to come. Clara stood at her kitchen window, watching the pale morning light creep across her scorched pasture. The letter in her hand trembled. Harsh words stared back at her from the page. "Sell now, or worse will come." The cattle baron's threat was clear as the rising sun. Daniel sat at the table, spooning up his porridge. "Mama, why are you frowning?" She tucked the letter into her apron pocket. "Just thinking about some business in town today, sweetheart." Clara smoothed his dark hair, grateful for every moment with him after the fire. "You'll stay with Mr. Lapp while I speak to the council." The morning passed in a blur of chores. By mid-afternoon, Clara's wagon rolled toward town, the steady clip of hooves matching her heartbeat. Samuel rode beside her in his own cart, his presence a quiet comfort. Though it broke with Amish custom to involve himself in English affairs, he had insisted on coming. "The Lord guides our steps," he said simply when she'd protested. Main Street buzzed with whispers as they pulled up to the meeting hall. Clara straightened her skirts, gripping the water rights papers in one hand. Samuel fell into step beside her, ignoring the stares their partnership drew. Inside, lamplight cast long shadows across rough-hewn benches. The council members sat at their table, Pastor Whitcomb among them, while Jed Collins and his cattle baron friends lounged near the back, radiating menace. Clara's throat tightened at their smirks. Before she could speak, the door creaked open. Longhawk entered, his moccasins silent on the wooden floor. Gasps rippled through the crowd. He wore his finest leather vest, adorned with careful beadwork that caught the light. His gray-streaked hair was neatly braided, his bearing proud but peaceful. "This meeting is for townsfolk only," Jed Collins sneered. "My grandson's future lies in your words today," Lone Hawk replied evenly. "I have right to speak." Clara's heart swelled at his courage. She stepped forward, papers clutched to her chest. "Members of the council, I come before you again because threats have been made against my family and our land." She drew out the cattle baron's letter, her voice growing stronger. "These men would steal what's rightfully ours through fear and fire. But I stand here with proof of our claim, supported by those who know truth and justice." Samuel moved closer, his steady presence lending her strength. Lone Hawk stood like a sentinel nearby, embodying generations of connection to the land. "My son Daniel carries 2 proud bloodlines," Clara continued, her voice ringing clear. "He is heir to his grandfather's wisdom of these prairies, and to his father's people who have watched over this land since before any of us arrived. The water rights are legally mine, but the truth is, water belongs to no man. It's meant to sustain all life, not just the richest ranches." Jed Collins pushed off the wall. "Pretty speech, widow, but this ain't about water. It's about keeping things proper, natural-like. There's nothing more natural than a mother protecting her child." Clara shot back. "Nothing more proper than honest folks standing together against bullies and threats," the crowd muttered. Pastor Whitcomb shifted in his chair, conflict clear on his face. Clara watched him wrestle with conscience versus convenience. Lone Hawk spoke then, his words measured and deep. "I have seen 70 summers on these plains, watched treaties made and broken, seen hate poison good land like bad water. But I have also seen healing spring up like prairie grass after fire." He gestured to Clara and Samuel. "Here stand 2 from different worlds, choosing respect over fear. My grandson bridges more worlds still. In him flows the strength of all his ancestors. This is the future that must grow here." Silence fell. The pastor rose slowly, his hands gripping his Bible. "Brothers and sisters," he began, voice quavering but growing firm. "We have let fear and greed blind us to God's clear command, to love our neighbors as ourselves. Mrs. McCall has proven her legal right to her land. More importantly, she and her son have proven their worth through dignity under trial." He turned to face the cattle barons. "Any further threats or actions against them will face the full force of both law and Christian conscience. This community must choose justice over convenience, love over fear." Clara felt tears threatening. She hadn't expected the pastor's support, hadn't dared hope for such clear conviction. The council chairman cleared his throat. "Motion to formally recognize Clara McCall's water rights and property claim with full protection under local law." "All in favor?" Hands rose around the room. First Samuel's, then the pastor's, then others following like stalks of wheat bowing in wind. Even some who had shunned her before voted yes. shame and sympathy mixing on their faces. "Motion carried," the chairman declared. "Mrs. McCall, you and your son are under this town's official protection. Any man who troubles you answers to all of us." Jed Collins and his friends stormed out, boot heels striking the floorboards like gunshots. Clara knew their threat wasn't over. Men like that didn't yield power easily. But something had shifted in the room's atmosphere, like storm clouds finally breaking. People began to file out, many nodding to her with new respect. Lone Hawk touched her shoulder gently. "You have shown great courage, daughter. Daniel will grow strong here now." "Thank you," Clara whispered. For everything. The hall emptied until only Clara, Samuel, and the pastor remained. Whitcomb approached them, hat in hands. "I apologize for my silence when you needed support," he said. "Fear of man is a poor substitute for fear of God." Clara managed a tired smile. "Thank you for speaking truth today. That's what matters now." Exhaustion swept over her as they stepped out into the golden evening light. Her knees felt weak with relief and spent emotion. Samuel's hand steadied her elbow as they walked to their wagons. "The Lord provides strength when we need it most," he said softly. Clara looked up at him, this quiet man who had risked his community's disapproval to support her. "He does," she agreed. "Often through the hearts and hands of others." The sun painted the street in amber as they prepared to head home. Clara knew challenges still lay ahead, fences to mend, prejudices to overcome, threats to weather. But for now, she let herself feel the victory of truth spoken and justice done. Her son would grow up knowing both his heritage and his worth. That was worth any struggle. The piece of victory shattered like glass that night. Clara had just tucked Daniel into bed when the first shot cracked through the darkness. Windows exploded inward, sending shards skittering across the floorboards. "Daniel, get down." Clara grabbed her son, pulling him behind the stone hearth. More bullets splintered the doorframe. Daniel trembled against her as she shielded him with her body. Samuel burst through the back door, lantern swinging. "Stay low." He dove behind the hearth with them as another shot punched through the wall. The lamp crashed to the floor, plunging them into darkness broken only by muzzle flashes outside. "Are you hurt?" Samuel's voice was steady despite the chaos. "We're all right," Clara whispered, holding Daniel closer. But there, a new sound cut through the night, sharp whistles and hoofbeats approaching fast. 3 riders emerged from the darkness, led by Lone Hawk. Their warning shots drove the attackers back from the house. Cowards fire at women and children. Lone Hawk's voice carried across the yard. "Face us if you dare." More shots exchanged, then cursing and retreating hoofbeats. Lone Hawk and his companions maintained their guard while Samuel lit fresh lamps. Clara noticed blood darkening his sleeve. "You're wounded," she gasped, reaching for him. "Just a graze." But he didn't resist as she led him to the kitchen table by lamplight. Clara cleaned and bandaged Samuel's arm, her fingers gentle against his skin. Daniel watched wide-eyed as Lone Hawk and his men secured the property. "Thank you," Clara whispered, not lifting her eyes from her task. Not just for tonight, but for everything. Standing beside us when so many turned away. Samuel's other hand covered hers, where it rested on his bandaged arm. Their eyes met in the soft light, and Clara felt something shift between them, something deeper than gratitude, warmer than friendship. No words were needed. The touch of their hands said everything. They stayed like that until Lone Hawk returned to report the property was clear. Together, they would guard the ranch until dawn, an unlikely family united against the darkness, weary but unbroken. The next morning dawned clear and quiet over the prairie town. Word of the night's violence spread quickly, and something shifted in the hearts of the townspeople. They had seen enough hatred. Mrs. Peterson from the Mercantile was the first to arrive at Clara's ranch, her arms laden with fresh-baked bread and preserves. "It ain't right," she declared, setting the food on Clara's scarred table. what them cattle barons been doing. Throughout the day, more neighbors came. Men arrived with fence posts and lumber, working alongside Samuel to repair the bullet holes and broken windows. Women brought quilts to replace those shredded by gunfire. Even those who had once whispered behind their hands now looked Clara in the eye, shame and determination mingling in their gazes. Sheriff Raines rode up around noon, his deputy beside him. Clara watched from her porch as they dismounted, their faces grim but resolute. "Ma'am," the sheriff said, removing his hat, "we found proof linking the cattle barons to both fires and last night's attack. They're in custody now." Through the window, Clara glimpsed Jed Collins and his cohorts being led away in iron shackles. Her hands trembled as she gripped the porch rail, remembering how close they had come to destroying everything she held dear. When Sunday arrived, the little white church was packed full. Clara walked down the aisle with her head high, Daniel between her and Samuel. Lone Hawk, dressed in his finest buckskins, joined them in the pew. A few people stared, but most smiled in welcome. Pastor Whitcomb stood at his pulpit, his Bible open before him. "Today," he began, "we speak of forgiveness and unity. We have witnessed great courage in our midst, courage that knows no boundaries of culture or custom. Through their example, we are reminded that God's love embraces all his children." The congregation raised their voices in hymn. Clara felt tears slip down her cheeks as the familiar words of Amazing Grace filled the sacred space. Daniel's clear voice joined the singing, while Samuel's deeper tones harmonized beside her. Even Lone Hawk hummed along, his weathered face peaceful. Looking around the church, Clara saw faces that had once turned away now lifted in song together. The spirit of peace that filled the sanctuary felt like a healing balm after so many weeks of strife. The evening wrapped the prairie in gentle darkness as lamplight spilled from Clara's ranch house windows. Inside, the rooms hummed with warmth and fellowship. Neighbors crowded around long tables laden with steaming bowls of beef stew and plates of golden cornbread, their spoons clinking against ceramic as stories and laughter filled the air. In the corner by the hearth, Samuel sat with Daniel, their heads bent together over a piece of pine wood. Samuel's skilled hands guided the boy's smaller ones, showing him how to whittle safely. Wood shavings curled at their feet as a horse's shape slowly emerged beneath their careful work. Lone Hawk settled into the rocking chair nearby, his deep voice carrying tales of brave Comanche riders and wise chiefs who had roamed these same plains. Daniel's eyes shone as he learned of his mother's people, pride replacing the shame that had once shadowed his heritage. Other children gathered around, drawn by the stories, their parents listening too with new respect. Clara stood in the doorway between kitchen and parlor, taking in the scene before her. The room glowed golden in the lamplight, filled with faces that had turned from suspicious to friendly, hearts that had opened to understanding. Her throat tightened with emotion as she watched her son, secure between his two grandfathers, belonging fully to both worlds at last. As the evening drew to a close, neighbors departed with warm handshakes and promises to return. The house grew quiet save for the soft crackle of the dying fire. Daniel, worn out from excitement, had already fallen asleep in his bed, his new wooden horse clutched close. Samuel stayed behind, helping Clara clear away the last dishes. When the kitchen was tidy, she turned to him, her voice trembling. "I cannot thank you enough, Samuel, for everything." He took her hand in his work-roughened fingers gentle against her skin. His clear eyes met hers, steady and sure. Though he spoke no words, his gaze held all the promises her heart had longed to hear of acceptance, of devotion, of a future shared. Together, they stepped out onto the porch. The night air carried the sweet scent of prairie grass, and overhead, stars scattered like diamonds across the velvet sky. Their joined hands spoke of new beginnings, of love found in unexpected places, of hope blooming as bright as morning glories after rain. If something in this story whispered to your spirit, stay a while. Subscribe and come back tomorrow. The next story may be the one you didn't know you needed.